Welcome. My name is Warren Scheel, and I'm a family lawyer in Los Angeles, California, certified family law specialist. And we're fortunate today to have with us Amira Hassenbush. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And Amira she's a lawyer. She has a law degree from UCLA, but also she has a master's of public health from UCLA, and you also have a degree, a BA from Berkeley in public health. So why become a lawyer?
Good question. I did not plan on becoming a lawyer. I thought lawyers were just the worst people in the world, And I had a lot of experience in public health from my background with my bachelor's degree. I actually worked as an asthma health educator in the Oakland public schools. And I went in every day and I taught the kids how to take their medications and how to avoid their triggers. But we sat there and it was like, well, if they weren't building houses right next to freeways, probably half these kids wouldn't have asthma in the first place. And so it started me down the road of thinking about public health law and how laws and policies impact the greater health environment. And so I ended up going to law school and getting my master's in public health at the same time and planning on doing policy work. And then it's an even longer story as to how I ended up practicing. But now I'm a practicing lawyer.
So hopefully we're going to talk about surrogacy and assisted reproductive technologies. But given your experience with public health, how do you think we're doing in this country right now?
I think we leave a little to be desired. Granted, it is a novel situation. No one has ever had to deal with this specific situation before, but we have had infectious diseases before. We have had, contact tracing and trying to find cures and trying to find vaccines, and all of those kinds of things are not new concepts. And what I'm seeing is inconsistent messaging that is creating a lot of confusion and unfortunately not helping our situation. And the countries where there is the most consistent messaging tends to be better. It's also the countries that are a little bit more authoritarian, which just isn't the United States, right? And to a certain extent, it's going to be hard because that's not our value. That's not how we live. We really believe in having a lot of freedoms, but that comes with a cost, and we're paying that cost right now.
I was watching or listening to I think the Vice President of Taiwan over the weekend. He was being interviewed, and I believe his background is epidemiology. And he was asked that question. Taiwan is not obviously as big as the US. There's about 25 million people. And they have no quarantine. They have a very robust tracing system in place, and also testing, so that if you are tested positive for coronavirus, there's immediate tracing of all your contacts, and then both you and your contacts have to go into quarantine for 14 days. And they asked him, well, it's a democratic country, isn't that a restriction on civil liberties? And his response was, we've had less than 20 deaths, we've got less than a couple of thousand cases, and all we've asked is a few thousand people to go into quarantine for 14 days, which, if you look at it that way, is far less restrictive. But anyway.
Yeah, it's always a balancing act. Public health law is, by definition, a balancing act. When I was in law school, I actually taught an undergraduate class on public health law, and we would take a law each week and then look at the constitutional right that law would inevitably infringe upon in some way, and look at how that balancing happens. But it's inherent in doing something for the greater good. Usually you are somewhat giving up some level of individual right in order to do that. So.
I think also, and I'm sorry to go off track here, but
interesting though.
This morning I was talking to a friend from college who is a lawyer in London and works extensively in Greece and Cyprus. And if you look at the statistics on Greece, a country which is not necessarily known for its robust and strong government, it has one of the lowest coronavirus and COVID deaths rates per capita. And I asked him why, and he said, well, it's because people respect public health, and they also respect the authorities, because everybody has to do, public service or go in the army. There's national service. So there's a lot of respect for the authorities. So when the authorities say you have to voluntarily wear a mask or do this, or, don't gather in groups of more than 6 people, people tend to listen. And I've seen also, I've got clients and working with cases in Sweden, and Sweden has been rolled out as an example of a country that hasn't quarantined and is doing very well. But people forget that the Swedish people, again, have a lot of respect for authority, and that when they're told to behave a certain way, they tend to listen. Whereas the countries that are not doing very well, my sense is that they don't have, or that they may used to have, but not now, sort of such a respect for authority, government. And so when you erode that faith in institutions, then when a pandemic or some public health crisis comes along, you don't do very well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've read that Sweden, by comparison to other Scandinavian countries, is actually doing much worse.
That's true.
So, it's all relative, and it all depends on sort of, it's everything together, right? There's no one thing that is the panacea. You have to be having testing that is more effective and that is shorter turnaround time to get the results. You have to have the contact tracing, and you either have to have an authoritarian government or people willing to listen to a non-authoritarian, it all works together. And, we've seen lots of different experiments happening on the ground now and how they're playing out.
So, Amira, tell me a bit about your practice and what you do.
Yeah, so now my practice is family formation. So I help people with adoption, surrogacy, sperm donation, egg donation, and I focus on LGBT families, but of course I'm happy to help anybody who needs the help. So that's kind of where the bread and butter of my work is these days.
And what's your typical client? What kind of help do they need in forming a family?
Yeah, so I usually have 1 or 2 categories of clients. Like I said, I focus on LGBT families, so I have a lot of LGBT families who either have already had children and come to me to legally protect the families that they've created, or who are building their families and looking into surrogacy or sperm donation or egg donation or some combination or adoption. And I help them to get to the other side of that, to have the children that they want to have and to legally protect those as well. And usually my other clients are clients who either are LGBT or not, but are struggling with infertility. And so then they're also sort of going in the non-traditional, or, not just like pop a bottle of wine and have a fun night at home kind of way of family building, So I help them with the more complicated way of doing it.
And you mentioned first that you help couples when they do have a family, if they have problems with the family relationship or legally. How do you help in that way?
Yeah, so sometimes it's not even that there are problems. I'll tell people it's kind of like family insurance. So for example, lesbian couples who are married in the state of California are both the legal parents of the child who's born, even if only one is the biological mother. Now let's bracket to the side here that both can be biological parents jointly, because you can have one contribute the eggs and the other gestate the child. But even if that's not the case, even if only one is biologically connected to the child, California law will recognize both of them as the legal parents. That being said, I would never tell a lesbian couple in California, you're good, leave it alone. I would tell them to do what's called a confirmatory adoption to further legally protect their rights, because a judgment of parentage is what is more likely to be recognized outside of the state of California. And even though we're all living in our little bubbles right now, normally we all travel and go to other places, and I want to make sure that my families are protected no matter where they go.
Is there a particular type of order of parentage that they need to get for it to be enforceable in another state?
So the full faith and credit clause requires that all judgments from every state be recognized in any other state in the country. That being said, the word adoption is universally recognized. An adoption order, an adoption judgment can easily travel without a problem. We can get parentage judgments in California also, but not every state has that. So you may have to domesticate it. People may find it confusing. It just might not be sort of the ideal choice given the logistics on the other end. So even though other states are supposed to be recognizing them, you also have to know what's going to be the easiest thing to deal with.
Have you had a situation where two same-sex parents have adopted and then they've moved to another state and that other state hasn't recognized the adoption?
No.
Does that happen in some states? Have you heard of that?
I've heard of cases where, there was a Supreme Court case in, I think it was Alabama, where they,
Of course, yeah.
they didn't want to recognize the adoption. And I think at that point can't remember if they were on the birth certificate. I think they were trying to get both of them on the birth certificate. And Alabama had a law that said anybody who does an adoption is allowed to have both people on the birth certificate, and they wouldn't do it. And it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said, full faith and credit, we don't care if you wouldn't have agreed to this adoption. The adoption already happened. It's a judgment from another state, and you therefore have to treat it like any other adoption judgment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not that familiar with, I'm going to call it, is it right to call it the acronym ART, Assisted Reproductive Technology? Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about art, I'm not talking about Picasso or Monet. Right. It's very confusing. It's not an area I practice in, but I know that you've got egg donors, you've got sperm donors, you've got IVF, and I suppose there's the potential, when you read in the newspapers, for there to be multiple parents, biological and intended parents and presumed parents. Can you sort of clear some of that up for me, and how in California the courts impose those kind of legal obligations on various parties to these transactions or agreements?
Yeah, how much time do you have? I mean, that's a big question, right? And so
I'm not going anywhere.
All right. Well, let's see if we can do a mini version of this. So let's start with the biological, right? So you have the egg contributor, the sperm contributor, and the gestator, right? So those can be 3 different people.
Let me stop you there. Sorry, the gestator.
Yes.
What is the gestator?
That is what would either be the mother of the child, the intended mother of the child, or the surrogate, right? So a woman who is carrying a child on behalf of someone else because that person is unable to, have their own pregnancy and carry their own child to term.
Right.
So there are generally three biological connections to a child, right? And those can all be different people. Now, they also may or may not be the intended, presumed, or legal parents of the child, which are all different sets, right? So the intended parents, that's pretty straightforward. It is the people who intend to be the parents. And so there may be, for example, a straight couple, let's say both people are struggling with infertility. So they may have used a sperm donor, they may have used an egg donor, and then they may have also hired a surrogate to carry it. And so that couple are the intended parents, and everybody else is helping them on their journey, but they are not the intended parents, and they may be biological contributors. Now, there are several presumptions of parentage within California family law. The vast majority of them are related to marriage. So there are conclusive presumptions and, rebuttable presumptions, and it's like a little more for today's conversation that I think we want to get into. But generally, a child that is born within a marriage will be presumed to be the child of both of the people within the marriage. There's also a presumption, sort of what's called the holding out presumption. So if a person takes a child into their home and holds that child out as their natural child, that can also establish over time and create a presumption of parentage. So
can I stop you there for 1 second? So let's say you have a couple who are not married.
Right.
And both of them are the biological parents, but for whatever reason, let's say another father has helped, raise that child. Which one wins out? The presumptive parent who's been helping raise the child, or is it the biological parent?
It really depends. I cannot say just based on that alone what the answer is. California does now allows for more than 2 parents. So the answer might not be either or. The answer might be yes and, right? So biology alone does not carry the day in California, especially after the child's 2nd birthday. It really is about who has established themselves as a parent within the child's life. But caring for a child can take on many different roles, right? There are nannies, there are grandparents, there are step-parents, there are a variety of different caretaker roles that are not parental roles. And so this holding out provision is really about people who are acting as parents. And so there are, for example, non-monogamous relationships that, or, couples with more than, it's not a couple, right? Relationships with more than two people where the intent may have been that all three of us are going to be parents, right? Or you could talk about, for example, a lesbian couple and their gay best friend who's going to be their sperm donor. And maybe they use eggs from one, they use the other, the other woman carries the child, and the man is the sperm donor. So they're all biologically related, and they all intend to be parents, and they all act as parents, and they all raise the child together, right? Families can come in many, many different shapes and sizes and forms, and I deal with all kinds of them in my practice. And what we do is what I try to do is get people to make those plans before they get started. And sometimes that means going to therapy first and really talking it out. And then once everybody's on the same page about what they want, then I tell them, okay, here are the presumptions in the law that exist to help you. Here are the ones that are going to hurt you. Here's what we can do to get around that or not. And then they need to make their own decisions based on what they can or can't do within the law. The law doesn't have a half parent. You don't get to sometimes be a parent, sometimes not. You don't get to have custody and not owe child support, right? Like it's a bundle of rights and obligations. They all come together, and you're either 100% or 0%. So, I help people to try to end up on one side or the other, and the side that they intended to be on, but that can be complicated.
So I want to take the example of the most, chefs in the kitchen, as it were. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but a situation where you have a same-sex couple, they have to undergo IVF, they need a sperm donor, an egg donor, and then they need someone else to be a surrogate.
Okay.
And they come in your office. Well, I guess the first question is, who needs to be on their team? Where do they need to get advice from first?
Mm-hmm.
Where do they go?
Yeah. So I'm assuming a same-sex male couple based on this?
It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter.
It can go either way. Okay. So we're just assuming all gametes are donated. We need a surrogate. So I would say coming to me first is a good place to start because I can kind of direct, but they're going to need on their team medical, right? They're going to need a doctor who can help them with the donations, the retrievals, the IVF, the transfer, which the insemination, whatever you want to call those things, so there's going to be a whole medical team. Often when people are looking for donors and surrogates, they are finding people who they didn't know previously. And so they often will use an agency to help match them with egg donors, with surrogates. Sperm donation is not usually a matching service. Usually you just kind of, because sperm freezes very easily on its own, they can pre-collect sperm and have it sort of sit in the freezer, and you can just kind of look through the catalog and pick out your donor and buy what's already sort of on the shelf, if you will. Whereas with egg donors, eggs don't freeze as well by themselves. And so usually what they're trying to do is create embryos. So an embryo is an egg and a sperm combined. And so what you'll do is you'll select your egg donor, she'll get medically cleared, she will make a directed donation to you. And then at that time, when they retrieve the eggs from her body, they will also usually at that point inseminate those and do the in vitro fertilization with whatever the sperm is that people have chosen and freeze the embryos. That's sort of a safer bet. That being said, there are some eggs that are just out there and frozen that you can sort of do the same process. But so usually there's going to be an agency or a gamete bank, whether it's a sperm bank or an egg bank, where you're going to find your donors. You can also use an agency to find your surrogate. You need an insurance specialist who's going to be helping you to think about all of the health insurance issues that are coming through this. If you're working with a surrogate who you don't know, you're going to be needing to have an escrow account. So you're going to need an escrow fund. So all of these things kind of come together, and all of the partners we all work in the same field. We know each other. We can send referrals out. You're going to need psych, right? I said the first thing I usually do is send people to therapy. There are only a handful of therapists who really specialize in third-party reproduction. You can talk to people about these kinds of issues. So you need somebody who really understands that. And all of that is assuming domestic, right? If it's international, then we're talking about lawyers back home in whatever country they're in. We're talking about, even within the United States, if they're outside of California, if there's crossovers from different states, you need to talk to lawyers in the home states and all states to check on what the process is. How are we going to get a birth certificate? Is it easier to get a judgment in the state where the baby's born or the state where the intended parents live, if those are two different places, right? So there's a lot of coordination that goes into it and a lot of communication between many, many parties to make this come together.
Well, I'll ask you about, foreign foreign law issues in a minute, but I guess you've answered my question. Is the first place to go, the first point of contact will be you, because you know everyone in Los Angeles, the agencies, and are the agencies and the fertility clinics one and the same, or are they generally different?
They're generally different. There are some fertility clinics that have attached agencies, so it just depends, but usually they're different.
Now, I know I've had clients, actually quite a few clients, that have come from other countries to California because I presume because the fertility clinics, particularly with same-sex couples, are very advanced and have technology. But is it also because of the law in California? It carries well to other countries?
Yeah, it's all the above. So international parents come to the United States all the time. It's very, very common because generally speaking, we are a much more surrogacy-friendly country than almost any other country in the world. And among the states in the United States, California is among the top of states in terms of being surrogacy-friendly. So we're called a pre-birth order state. So you can get a judgment before the baby's born that the intended parents are the parents and that the surrogate, and if she's married, her spouse, are not the legal parents of the child. Because again, we get that marital presumption of marriage. So if the surrogate's married, we need to get her spouse on board as well. So literally it can be the baby is born and at the hospital, the social worker already has the judgment of parentage and the intended parents are on the birth certificate from the beginning. There's no adoption afterwards, there's no amendment of a birth certificate, it's all very smooth. So people like to come here because of the legal protections that we have in place. And yes, we also have some of the foremost fertility clinics. We have a lot of surrogacy and, egg donor and sperm donor agencies. Southern California is a huge hub for it. So people come. Now,
yeah, before we spoke, I just did a sort of some quick research. I found an article, actually, I think it was in Vogue. It said that the China produces or provides the most people coming over to California for surrogacy services. Do you know what percentage come from other countries to take advantage of California?
I honestly, I don't know. A lot, nope. A large percentage.
Because I imagine that, there's going to be a lot of people from other countries watching this.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the legalities of doing this, because you've got now the example that we had where you've got a same-sex couple, you have the gestator, you have the intended parents, you have the sperm donor, the egg donor, the fertility specialist. I mean, that's a lot of people there. Now, what kind of agreements did you have to execute to make sure that the child that's born gets to the right parents, or the right parents have the right legal rights and responsibilities over that child that's the product of this process?
Right. So I can tell you about the legal agreements that I draft, and then I can tell you about the legal agreements that the intended parents will handle, because it's a lot more than just what I draft. So I draft, if you're assuming we have, right, everything is donated, you're going to have a sperm donor agreement between the intended parents and the sperm donor. You're going to have an egg donor agreement between the intended parents and the egg donor. On both of those agreements, the way that I draft them, I also add an exhibit that's really an agreement only between the intended parents, assuming there are two intended parents, that talks about what to do with those gametes in the event of death or separation, right? Because otherwise, that's kind of left out there for who knows when one of those things happens, right? Because often people do have extras that sit in the freezer. And so we need to think about what to do with those. And you're gonna have a surrogacy agreement between the surrogate and the intended parents. And then after you've completed the surrogacy agreement, when the surrogate is somewhere getting into her second trimester, is when you then go to court and you actually do the judgment of parentage. Now, on top of that, for agreements, the intended parents will look at agreements with their fertility clinics, with their agencies, right? They'll have all those other agreements to look at as well. And sometimes those are well designed for intended parents of all kinds, and other times they're not well written, and you have to look at, is this going to protect me in my specific situation? If I'm in a same-sex couple And, I'm not the sperm donor, I am the intended parent who's using my sperm, right? Is this language in the clinic, or the clinic forms actually accommodating my situation? So I tell clients all the time, read carefully and don't be afraid to scribble out. Like, if it's not right, it's not right. And that can hurt you later.
So if one of those parties, where let's say the fertility clinic or the agency gives you a bunch of agreements, they say, well, these are templates, these are standard agreements, we do this in every case, and it covers every situation, it's going to cover every party, just sign here on the dotted line. Kind of like when you refinance your house and someone shows up with about 300 pages and they say, I've got to be out of here in like 10 minutes, just sign everywhere. And there's no way you could read all these documents or understand these documents. Do you tell your clients just sign them, or do you tell them come to someone like you to look over them and give advice?
I would never tell them to sign them. I bought a house, we had 120 pages of documents. I read every page before I signed everything. So no, I would never tell you. I mean, I'm the person who signs up at a gym and is like scribbling out on the waiver form at the gym. So I would never tell people to sign. And a fertility clinic shouldn't be handing you a stack of documents to sign immediately. They should be giving you time to read them all. And if they don't, to me, that's a bit of a red flag. And I tell clients, if I'm working with you through the entire journey and I'm doing all of your other paperwork, I'll often review, the agency contract for free. Like, I'll just throw that in as part of my services. And so don't be afraid to take the time and make sure that you're doing this correctly and that the forms are accurate, because a lot of litigation that people see in the case law is where forms were inaccurate, or at least someone's claiming that the forms were inaccurate and that they didn't really mean what it said on the forms, and they thought, well, there's no other option, so I guess we'll just sign it as it is.
Can you think of an example, either in case law, in your own or in your own personal practice, where you've seen a form produced by someone else and there's been something missing that you've changed?
Yeah, so like I said, a lot of the forms, even in fertility clinics that are used to dealing with people who are dealing with infertility, this is not as much of a problem anymore, but historically they were written for a husband and a wife, right? And so it would say, we're using his sperm, he's going to be the parent, and we're using this egg donor, and she, the wife, is going to be the intended mother. Well, what happens when, or even if it's IVF, right, and it's not an egg donor, right? Like the old forms, it was just IVF with husband's sperm, wife's eggs. We're just doing it in a petri dish, right? And so there was no language for egg donor. There was no language for, intended parent. And when you have a same-sex couple, especially a female same-sex couple, right, they can be doing IVF and using a sperm donor. But if it says intended father as the sperm provider, because they're used to a different sex couple where the sperm provider is the intended father, well, great, now you've turned your sperm donor into a father. Like, you don't want to do that. And so you really need to make sure. I've seen, surrogacy contracts that people have printed off the internet from God only knows where, and the very first paragraph says, names the surrogate and then says, comma, intended mother. And I'm like, no, like that's not right. We have to go back and amend the whole document, because sometimes people call me when their surrogate is 7 months pregnant and we're doing a little bit of cleanup at the very last minute, or a lot of cleanup. So, these things can get very messy.
I think it's fairly safe advice to give anyone when they're looking for an important document, legal document that's going to create very important legal rights and obligations that may last for the rest of your life. Never just get it off the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you some stories about that.
Yeah. Well, if you've got time, I'd love to hear some of those stories. But is it possible to have an agreement where you create, I think you mentioned this before, but actually craft an agreement where more than two parents, there are more than two parents have custody rights?
Yes, you can create an agreement where there are more than two parents. As you know, in family law, you can't sort of waive or set custody to a certain extent, because it's all going to be about best interest of the child, right? So you can say these 3 people are all legal parents, and therefore they're all going to have rights to claim custody. But then what that actually may be, if they ever split up in the future, is left to the courts. So for example, if you have couple, like I had said, if you do, either a group of people who are sort of in a polyamorous relationship, you could do it for something like that. You could do it with friends who intend to co-parent together. There have been, a lesbian couple and a gay couple, and maybe they use one's sperm and one's eggs and embryo, and uterus, but the spouses also intend to be parents, and so then you've got a 4-parent family. There's all kinds of ways that people can become parents in more than just 2.
What's the biggest family unit that you've dealt with in an agreement? You said 4. I can't imagine.
So 4 wasn't my case. It was someone I knew. I don't think I've ever done more than 3. I've done 3. So. And
do you do follow-up afterwards to see how that works out?
Often when I'm brought in on a 3-parent case, it's after it's already not worked out. So we are negotiating and figuring things out and trying to establish, sometimes was the intent for there to be 3 parents? What really happened here, and what was the intent from the beginning, and has that changed, right? That holding out provision means that the landscape can be shifting under your feet without you realizing it. There's a relatively famous case where there was a man who was with his girlfriend. They were having fertility problems, and I think he froze sperm. I can't remember if he froze sperm or if they made embryos together. But they ended up breaking up. And after they broke up, he wrote her a letter and he said, "Look, you're going to be a great mother. You can use my sperm. I'll be your donor. I don't want to prevent you from having a child. I know that's really important to you." She said, great. She went ahead and got pregnant, and then they were on again, off again. They get back together. He created a room in his home for the child. He started taking the child regularly with him. He then became listed as the father on the nursery school forms. He started acting as a father. And the court ruled that even though he started as a donor, he turned himself into a parent by holding the child out. So these things are sometimes messy, and, life is not black and white like the law is. And even if everybody has one intent going in, that can sometimes legally and logistically change as time goes on.
Another case that's been in the news in the last couple of years is a well-known actress, and it was a litigation over an embryo, where there was frozen about who had the rights to use the embryo and whether she could be inseminated with it. What happened with that case, and what were the issues involved?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about Sofia Vergara. I did not follow it super, super closely, but my understanding was that their contracts were pretty airtight, that it was very clear that if they broke up, they were not going to use the embryos together. It was actually her ex-boyfriend who was trying to use the embryos, which is unusual. It's usually, if there's a male and a female partner, it's usually the female partner who wants to use the embryos and that's, honestly,
it may have been because it was Sofia Vergara.
It may have. Honestly, I think that it was because it was Sofia Vergara, and because it was an ex-boyfriend trying to control his ex-girlfriend. That was my sense of what it was, because it's not hard to make more sperm, right? It's not hard to get that back. Whereas
that's what I've heard.
But it can be, right, like eggs have a shelf life, and at a certain point, you may not have any other options. And so that's why biologically it makes sense that it's more likely to be that the woman is the one who wants to continue to use embryos after a breakup than the man.
So, but what you're saying is primarily a contractual dispute. Now, what if the contract hadn't been this clear, but there was either no contract or it was ambiguous? Would the embryo be treated just as community property, and who would have rights over it?
Right. Well, so first of all, it depends on if they're married. I don't think they were married in that case, but if they're married, then yes, embryos and gametes are considered sort of property plus. They are, in some respects, property, but they clearly have a little bit more to them because they have the potential to become human life. They do become community property within a marriage, which can get complicated, and California does not have any appellate law on it. What they've found from courts around the country is there's basically 3 models that have held. One is the Contemporaneous mutual consent model, which basically says, if you two can't make a decision and you can't agree, then nobody gets to do anything until you can. And they will remain on ice until you can make a decision together. There's the contract model, which says whatever you wrote in your contract is what we're going to enforce. And then there's the balancing test model, which says, if, for example, you made embryos because the woman in this relationship was about to undergo chemotherapy, and you knew that these were going to be her last viable eggs, and she would no longer have any viable eggs left. And so these embryos are her last chance at having, genetically related children, or vice versa. If he was about to undergo chemotherapy and it was his last viable sperm, then they may allow the person who has no other genetic options to keep and use those embryos. The one sort of well-known case in California that's a trial court level decision, but it's about an 80-page decision, used the contract model. But in that case, it was very clear from the contract that it said if we split up, we dissolve the embryos and we don't use them. And the wife wanted to keep using them, and there wasn't any proof that she was incapable of making more eggs. And the court said, look, you had an agreement, we're going to enforce the agreement you had.
Is that the case out of San Francisco? I can't remember the name of the case. So there's no appellate decision. So do you have a prediction as to which one will prevail? Which is given a higher priority in California? Contract model?
I think California is a state that really values people's rights to not be forced to become parents. And so it was easy in that case to enforce the contract because it didn't force anyone to become a parent. I know that there is some work right now on legislation that is trying to set up a way for frozen gametes from a marriage to be transmuted during a divorce into separate property, and to state that the children who are born as a result of that will only be the children of the spouse that keeps them and uses them. Because that's the problem, is sometimes in divorces, people say, I'll give you the embryos, but I don't want those kids and I don't want to be financially responsible for them. I don't want custody of those kids. And there's no way to guarantee that under the law right now. So I think that what will happen in the courts will depend on what we can push through in the legislature. Because I think if we can protect people and say, you will not be a legal parent, you will not have any obligations, there's still obviously the complicated issue of, you may have genetic children out there, and how do you feel about that? But legally, you'd be more protected, and the courts may rule differently if those protections are put in place.
So in your practice, you do family formation. Do you also do litigation where these problems arise?
From time to time, yes. Yeah.
What percentage of your practice is family formation, and what percentage is litigation?
I generally don't take more than 2 or 3 litigation cases at any given time. And I'll have, but they can take up a massive amount of my time. So if you're talking about percentage in terms of number of clients, it's probably less than 10%. But in terms of numbers of hours, it can sometimes be 25 or 30 or 40% of my time, because litigation is a much more massive undertaking than transactional work.
Now, what about the cost of all of this? Can you give me a sort of ballpark figure of if two parents come in and want to go through, this process, how much is it going to cost, both in legal fees and medical fees and agency fees?
So the ballpark figure that I give people if they're going to go through a surrogacy with an egg donor is somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000. So people need to be prepared for it. It is very expensive. I mean, the surrogate's base fee in California usually starts at $30,000, right?
When you say base fee, that's just the practical base fee, or is there a statutory fee or guideline?
No, and there's no statutory requirement of what surrogates can or can't be paid. Some surrogates are, altruistic and they don't get paid anything. But typically in California, a starting sort of cost for a surrogate is $30,000. And I say base fee because that doesn't include things like her clothing allowance, right? She's going to need maternity clothing. There's going to be, a C-section fee if she has a C-section. There are all kinds of like pain and suffering for different things that she goes through. If you do, CBS, or you do an amniocentesis, and all those kinds of things will cost more because she is undergoing more pain and suffering to do that for you.
Oh, I see. So but that's the fee to the surrogate. And then part of the agreement would be that if there's any complications or she has to go additional procedures, then the fee would go up for that surrogate.
Right. And that also doesn't cover, if her health insurance doesn't cover her surrogate birth and pregnancy, then they may be paying health insurance premiums. They're always going to be paying the co-pays and the co-insurance and all of the medical costs involved. Usually there's a monthly sort of non-accountable balance just for things like
Mhm.
mileage to and from the doctor and parking and notary fees and postage and, some of the contracts are old, so they'll say things like the cost of long distance phone calls, which is no longer a thing. But, and if your surrogate is traveling or for you, or if your egg donor is traveling, right, then you're going to pay flights and hotels and things like that. So that's just covering the surrogate, right? That doesn't include the fertility doctor. That doesn't include the court filing fees. That doesn't include my legal fees. Or it doesn't include the escrow fund fees, all of that kind of stuff.
What is the typical cost of IVF?
So I don't know that as well. I understand that it can be somewhere around 15 to 30, I want to say, $1,000. But
And that's without health insurance. That's just flat.
health insurance almost never covers fertility in
Really?
California. Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very rare for it to cover it.
Does health insurance cover any of this process?
So if you get the right health insurance, it usually will cover the pregnancy, right? So many women get pregnant. As long as the health insurance doesn't have a carve out for surrogate pregnancy, it will usually cover the pregnancy. You do have to have a review because there are several plans in California that will put a lien on the surrogate's compensation. So they'll say, we'll cover the pregnancy, but we'll also put a lien on her compensation to recoup our costs.
Wow.
Yeah. So if it's not an ERISA plan and there's not federal preemption, which is a whole other conversation, you can usually limit it to no more than 1/3 of her compensation. And then you can think about how you write the contract to determine whether something is compensation or whether it's a reimbursement, because they can't ask for, if you're reimbursing her for mileage and things like that, that's not compensation to her. And so you think about like what actually is compensation and then what's 1/3 of that.
$1,000 a mile.
Yeah, so they do actually scrutinize those pretty closely and make sure that it's not, like somebody was telling me, one of the people who is at the collection agency was saying, yeah, somebody just labeled everything reimbursement and then thought that it would count. And we were like, no, these are clearly not reimbursement. So you do have to actually look at that.
And what about the legal fees? How much are they, and how do you break those down?
So legal fees, it varies from lawyer to lawyer. For me, typically, and I do change my fees if somebody's with an agency or not, because when you're doing an independent match without an agency, it's a lot more work on my end. So assuming that they're working with an agency, I typically charge $1,500 for an egg donor contract or a gamete donor contract, $2,500 for a surrogate contract, and $2,500 for the pre-birth order. So altogether, that's around $6,500.
Wow.
That doesn't cover any of the filing fees. That doesn't cover, I usually collect another $1,500 just for filing fees. And in Los Angeles County, you need to do background checks. So you've got to think about that, all the mailing, everything back and forth, all of those kinds of things.
So if you're saying the entire cost is 100 to 200,000,
we're a tiny,
and you're tiny, the lawyers are really good value. This is an example, a counterintuitive example of where the lawyers are really good value. And it's a good idea to go and see a lawyer.
Yes.
And I guess,
go ahead.
I mean, just when you were telling me about the reimbursement and the of the insurance policies and how they can then take up to 1/3 of the surrogate's fee.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would be a very important reason why you'd have to consult an attorney and also know what kind of insurance the surrogate has. You really have to know that stuff and how it works.
Yeah, so that's actually, I don't even do the insurance because the insurance changes every year and it changes from county to county and it's so detailed. Even I don't do that. I send that out to a special agency that just does surrogacy insurance reviews. And that's all they do. And they are brilliant at it and they review every single policy booklet in the country and can give great advice on it. And why am I going to kill myself to, try to keep up on it when it's a massive, massive job, when there's somebody else who can do it and they just do it all day, every day.
Let's talk about foreign cases. Since they are, I think, the majority of cases in California, at least based on what I've read. We're the surrogacy capital of the world. What kind of special issues come up with foreign residents that come here to have either IVF or use a sperm donor or an embryo?
Yeah, so it used to be the main issues were just thinking about what happens when you go back home. Is that judgment going to be recognized? Are you going to be able to get a birth certificate for your baby? If they're a same-sex couple, that gets much more complicated. I work with same-sex couples from all over the world, including, for example, in China. They're not going to recognize a judgment or a birth certificate with two men on the judgment as parents or on the birth certificate. And so a lot of Chinese same-sex couples will essentially go through the entire process with only one parent being on all of the paperwork. And then after they go home and they get the birth certificate and everything is done, then they'll come back and they'll do a second parent adoption. And the other parent will then adopt the child. So those cases are more complicated, more expensive. They're not typical, right? But you have to think about not just, what's happening here, but what's going to happen when they go back home. They need to consult with a fertility lawyer back home and talk about, birth certificates, parentage, citizenship. If some places like, I believe it's Hong Kong, they will not recognize surrogate births to the point that they won't give citizenship to a child who is born via surrogacy out of the country. And then that kid can't enroll in school, it becomes very complicated. So you have to make sure there are some places where it's completely illegal and could potentially come with, risk of imprisonment of the intended parents. So you need to be knowing what you're doing and making sure they're speaking with lawyers in their home countries who know what they're doing. But now, on top of all of that, we also have to think about getting into the country for the birth, right? It used to just be you got on a plane and you showed up when the baby was due or a little bit before the baby was due and you came to the hospital. And now we have to think about, are they going to be able to get into the country? Are they going to have to go to another country and quarantine for 14 days before they come here? Are we going to have to we put in powers of attorney and temporary guardianships and all kinds of things to protect their backup plan if they can't get here in time for the birth, and who's going to take care of the baby until they can get here, and all those kinds of questions. So it's gotten much more complicated.
So you said two things which were really interesting. I mean, everything you've said is really interesting, but something I didn't realize. Number one is there seems to be a workaround with Chinese couples through adoption. So are you saying that in China, if you do the second adoption, that's generally recognized? So in China, you could have a same-sex couple where both parents are recognized as the legal parents?
It's not clear to me if it's recognized, but if they were to ever come back to the United States and only one of them is on all the paperwork and only one of them is on the judgment and something were to happen here, they wouldn't be recognized as both parents here. I mean, maybe you could use that holding out provision argument, but I would rather have a judgment that legally recognizes both of them. And I always say, look, even if it won't help them when they go back home, we don't know when the law is going to change and when China will start actually recognizing same-sex couples. And don't you want to be ready for that when they do and have everything in place? So I'd rather at least try and do the best I can to get the paperwork in order in the way that they've intended it to be the whole time.
What countries make surrogacy illegal? You said they could imprison people for surrogacy.
I believe parts of Australia. I think Hong Kong. There are some countries that have recently they used to do surrogacy and now they've closed the doors to foreigners. I don't think there's imprisonment, but things like a lot of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, India, those were all sort of surrogacy hubs for a while because surrogates charged much less and the agencies were much less expensive, and then some terrible cases came out of there because it wasn't well regulated and they basically shut the doors to foreigners, and some of them completely shut down their surrogacy industries altogether. So, but the only ones I can think of off the top of my head are certain states in Australia. I believe you can be.
I'm surprised by that. I always thought Australia was fairly enlightened and quite liberal on these kind of issues, social issues.
Yeah, depends on where you go.
Interesting. Are there any special issues that arise when you decide to use a family member, like a close family member as a surrogate, instead of an agency suggestion?
Yeah, I tell people all the time those aren't usually legal issues, they're emotional issues, and so that's when I will most strongly recommend that people go to therapy. It's so easy to be like, we love each other, we've known each other forever, we don't need to have these conversations, we're good, let's go. And it is almost guaranteed that the relationship will be harder if you have a pre-existing relationship with this person than if it's a stranger, because you aren't able to negotiate at arm's length. You will have continuous contact after the birth. There will just be more emotional entanglement to deal with. And so it's absolutely imperative that people have those conversations. You know?
I'm looking at some notes that you sent me. I think we've covered pretty much everything. Finally, what words of warning or advice would you give to a family undergoing or starting upon this journey?
Talk. So like I said, you need to have these conversations. You need to have conversations with co-parents, you need to have conversations with your gamete donors, with your fertility doctors, with your agencies. This is going to be a long process, and it's going to be a very intimate one, and you want to make sure you're comfortable with every person who's involved along the way. So have those conversations and don't stop having those conversations. Save money, because like we said, it's going to be expensive, so start saving, you know, and do your research. There are tons of great resources out there. If you do the research, there's a lot of Facebook groups with information. Men Having Babies is an organization that's designed for gay men, but they do a survey on surrogacy for all their members, and they put it out to the public, and it has information on all different clinics and agencies, and is a great resource no matter what your family looks like for just getting more information. So, you know, go out there and find the information, because it's out there.
This has been a really interesting conversation, and there's a lot of important information. Thank you so much, Amira. Before we finish, would you like to just tell us your contact details, how we get hold of you, and whether you have a website, an email, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find me is through my website, which is allfamilylegal.com. If you're a social media person, that's our handles also. So on Instagram, we're All Family Legal. On Facebook, All Family Legal. On Twitter, and it's the Law Office of Amira Hazenbush. So if you can remember my name, you can find me.
And what's your office telephone number, if you give it out?
Yeah, sure. It's 323-813-1199.
And again, I'm Warren Scheel, lawyer, certified specialist in Los Angeles. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.